We cannot be just about the elections because an election by itself is not going to solve all these fundamental problems. We need to have these reforms simultaneously.
Hi, you've tuned into State of South Asia, a podcast from Himal South Asian, where we have the best minds on the region to unpack crucial issues affecting our politics, cultures, environments, and societies. I'm your host, Nayantara Narayanan. It's been 2 months since the end of the monsoon revolution in Bangladesh that toppled former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's government. The interim government that took over under the stewardship of Nobel Peace Prize winner Muhammad Yunus has had its work cut out for it. In many ways, its job has to get Bangladesh to start from scratch by restoring democratic institutions which Hasina and her Awami League had all but dismantled. To check in on how this interim government has done so far and the road ahead in rebuilding Bangladesh, I have with me Jyoti Rahman, who's a macroeconomist by training and a political commentator by choice. Jyoti, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast.
Thank you for having me, Nantara. Very happy to be here.
You live and work in Canberra, but you keep a close eye on developments in Bangladesh. Right off the bat, I want to ask you what public sentiment has looked like in Bangladesh over the last 2 months. Has the euphoria of the revolution and the post revolution days worn off as people have gone back to their lives as usual?
The life has not actually gone back to usual quite yet, and the reason for that we'll discuss throughout the conversation. It has been a roller coaster of emotions. So uh, early in August, or the long July, as we call it in Bangladesh now, 34th, 35th, 36th of July, which is 4th, 5th, and 6th, 3rd, 4th, and 5th of August. It was despair, right? From that despair after that came euphoria, and that quickly gave way to shock as the full extent or enormity of the challenges ahead came to fore. And then there has been paranoia of Awami League resurgence, of Islamist takeover, of military takeover, of communal violence. So sort of there's been fear of a lot of things that could go wrong. And yes, normalcy has not quite has come back. However, the sense of what has been achieved and what can be achieved is finally dawning on people. So, sort of euphoria has worn off, but so has probably fear and paranoia and sort of those kind of strong emotions. And people are probably getting to what lies ahead.
Okay, so here's a quick wrap of what has happened over the last 2 months. After massive countrywide student led protests in July, the Awami League government that had been in power for about 15 years fell on August 5th when Sheikh Hasina fled the country. Hasina had become increasingly autocratic and had packed institutions with members from her Awami League and other loyalists. Her government cracked down on dissent, and her rule was marked with allegations of forced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, and other human rights violations. Even though Bangladesh was considered a model of economic development, growth has been largely unequal, and that led to the widespread dissatisfaction, which was a major factor in the scale and intensity of the monsoon uprising. Elections in the country since 2013, all of which Hasina had won, have been considered sham elections with allegations of vote rigging or with boycotts by the opposition that left her unchallenged. Now, the interim government, whose chief advisor is Muhammad Yunus, is faced with the task of rebuilding institutions. This includes the judiciary, the security forces, and even the central bank. We're recording this episode on October the 9th, and just yesterday, Yunus made a statement that there could be no elections till reforms are enacted. Remember that Bangladesh's constitution says that in the event that the parliament is dissolved, elections need to be held within 90 days of dissolution. But this really is an unprecedented situation for the country. Jyoti, this interim government has no politicians. It certainly has no members from the Awami League. Tell us a little bit about the people who've made up this council of advisors.
So, formally, the Council of Advisor is headed by Professor Yunus, a well known economist, pioneer of microcredit, Grameen Bank, and all of that, and Nobel Peace Prize laureate. The council also includes technocrats. So the finance advisor, for example, is a former central bank governor. It includes a lot of activists, human rights activists. So the law advisor, for example, is an academic from Dhaka University, law professor, but well-known human rights activist for many decades. Another advisor had been an environmental activist. And then there are also youth leaders who actually participated or spearheaded the uprising. So that's the formal composition of the government. And it might be also useful to just note how they came about. The fall of Hasina or fleeing of Hasina came as a surprise to everyone. No one expected, hardly anyone expected that this would be this soon, this would be this rapid. And army basically made sure, they announced that even though army chief said he was taking responsibility, he used the word responsibility and not power. Usually the army declarations for these kind of things is that army has assumed power. That's not what he said. The students, the youth leaders, they made it very clear that they wanted Professor Yunus involved. They wanted a government, they wanted an administration headed by Professor Yunus. As we understand it, there were talks of a national government, including political parties, but the largest political party in Bangladesh that is not Awami League is the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, BNP, which had been in power before, and they declined to join a government that is not through an election. They have been cooperating with the interim administration, but they have formally, they want an election so that they can, if they win that election, they can form a government. That's what they have said. So interim government of technocrats, council of advisors, this was the only option left. So that's how the government came about. And Professor Yunus, he also said that he wanted some of the youth leaders involved in the government. That was one of the things he had said right at the beginning.
Right. What, in your view, has been the biggest challenges for the interim government? You're an economist, so I wouldn't be surprised if you said the economy. But also, what have they managed to do in the last couple of months?
Of course, economy is a challenge, and I suspect you'll ask me about the economic issues separately, so I'll leave that aside. Look, the single biggest challenge, immediate challenge, and the challenge that has not been fully addressed, even Professor Yunus himself said in an interview only a couple of days ago that it is, the word he used is that it's too soon to say we have been successful. We have not. That's what he said. And that challenge is law and order. Just to set the context here, Bangladesh has about 240,000 members of the police force. And then there are also other law enforcement agencies and paramilitary and so on. Of these 240,000, about half of them were employed, hired by the Awami League government. 80,000 of that were newly created positions. And these members, these individuals were all selected on their political leagues. And over the last decade, the police had become, and the other law enforcement agencies had become not only just instrument of repression, political repression, but also they had been criminalized at the local end. So when the revolution happened, uprising happened in July, August, it was the police and the law enforcement agencies that did most of the killings. It wasn't the army, it was the police and the other agencies that killed the students, that killed civilians. And there were also violence against the police. So across the country, several hundred police stations, police posts, thanas. After the revolution, police basically melted away. So there has been a law and order vacuum. And this is why, at the moment, the army has been deployed across the country with magistracy power to restore law and order. They're trying to hire several thousand new police members, but that would take time. You would have to take them in, you have to train them. So this is a huge problem. And this is the single biggest challenge at the moment. Broader than that, there is also challenge of restoring the civil administration that had also been politicized heavily. Judiciary had also been, again, sort of every organ of the state, every institution had been heavily politicized. You mentioned the central bank governor, and that is a huge thing because central bank governors, these are technocrats, right? These are these are people with PhDs and sort of they're not political by any means in any government. Even when the Pakistan army surrendered in Dhaka in 1971 on 16th of December, on the 17th, the central bank people of the former Pakistan State Bank, the Dhaka office, they showed up to work, and they went and they reported to the Indian generals and Mukti Bahini commanders that, look, we are here to work. We have a currency to run. We have banks to run. Whom do we talk to, right? And here we had the central bank governor and his deputies who ran away or who fled. So, sort of this is how politicized, how criminalized the whole state apparatus had been. This is also a bigger challenge. So, law and order is the immediate one, but also all the organs of the state.
And the other side of the coin to law and order is the judiciary, as you mentioned. And Sheikh Hasina was accused of packing the judiciary again with her loyalists. And about a week after the fall of her government, the president appointed a new chief justice. New judges have also been sworn in over the last couple of months. How hopeful are you that Bangladesh can rebuild an independent judiciary and have systems in place that will guarantee this independence?
In the short term, I'm quite hopeful because we are seeing appointments, and the people who had been appointed, many of them, most of them have been welcomed, as in, like, sort of, they have not been questioned for their incompetence, or they have not been questioned on their, credibility and so on. However, this is only at the top echelon, right? So, sort of the chief justice may be a person of, he is a person of highest caliber and integrity and so on. The next layer probably also, but as you go down to, sort of to the magistrates, and as you go to the police, sort of in charges in the local districts and so on, that's where the things become trickier, and that also takes longer. In the longer term, whether the whether we need to come up with, so this is why the reform, which is the buzzword in Dhaka at the moment, that and that's also why Yunus keeps saying that we need reforms before we can have an election, or we need reforms while we prepare for an election, which is I think how he put it, that we cannot be just about the elections, because an election by itself is not going to solve all these fundamental problems. We need to have these reforms simultaneously. This is the reason that we need to, for example, with the judicial appointment, the old constitution or the existing constitution basically says that president is going to appoint judges on the advice of the prime minister, and it also says that president cannot do anything contrary to what the prime minister wishes. Therefore, the constitution basically says that once you have a prime minister can appoint judges as they see fit. That's in the constitution. And, like, okay, Hasina politicized it to a maximum extent. But the legal document, the founding document that you have allows her to do so. Okay, next person might not be as malicious as Hasina, but that is no way to set up a modern state, right? So this is why the reform question is so important.
And I think that's why also the interim government has now announced a commission to look at constitutional reform. And that commission is supposed to submit a report in 90 days because, like you said, you have to have a document that allows for the safeguarding of these institutions.
Indeed. So the government has actually announced 6 commissions. So there is a constitution commission for the whole big picture. There is also a commission on judiciary itself. There is a commission on law enforcement, police, so police reform. There is another one on civil administration or public services. There is one on broader corruption, and there's one on the election. So the mechanics of election, that, like, sort of how can we prevent fraudulent elections. So Constitution Commission is obviously the big ticket one because that sets everything. And they all are supposed to report back in 90 days, which would take us to the new year, 2025. The political parties need to be involved because at the end, whilst it has come through a popular uprising, the government itself does not have any electoral popular mandate. So, we cannot say that we want a democratic Bangladesh or, we want to institute democracy by fiat. We cannot do that by decree. So political parties need to be involved. How that would happen remains to be seen. Would there be things like roundtable conferences, the way that, like, sort of the British had done before they had left, or colonial powers do before they leave? That could be an option. There could be bilateral discussions. There could be referendums. We don't know. So those are the big questions at the moment. We have these commissions. Next year we'll find out what the commissions recommend. Then we'll need to think about how the politicians, how to get their buy-in, and how that conducts with sort of carries with the election timeline. The other thing is that even though the constitution says that we have to have election in 90 days, at the moment that's just not feasible, because, as I said, there is no civil administration. There is no police to do this, and you cannot do this with an army, because army is not trained to do these kind of things. Army is trained to kill in the sort of in a war situation, all right? Whereas any election campaign is going to involve local disputes, right? They have to, because that's how these things work. And you would need people who are trained to diffuse those disputes without resorting to violence. Army should not be asked to do that. I don't think they want to do it, and therefore, it's just not feasible to have a election in 90 days. Which then leads to the question that, sort of, how would all of this be squared away with the new constitution? Will it be that a new parliament comes in, and would they have some political commitment to retrospectively amend all of those things? That's another question that remains to be seen.
So, in mid July, when Hasina's crackdown on protesters became violent and students were being killed in the streets, I interviewed the political scientist Ali Riaz on this podcast. And even though it was early days then, he said that the political ground had shifted in Bangladesh and that there was no going back to the way things were under Hasina's rule. Professor Riaz is now the head of the Constitutional Reform Commission, whose job it is to review and evaluate the existing constitution and to establish representative and effective democracy while empowering people. You can listen to that episode with Professor Riaz on our website himalmag.com or wherever you get your podcasts. It takes a lot to bring you in depth, independent coverage of the whole of South Asia, and at Himal, we rely on listeners like you. Support our work, which will help us bring you more stories and produce more podcasts like this one. You can become a patron of the magazine by clicking on the link in the episode notes or by going to our website and clicking Support Himal. You can also sign up to our newsletters to keep up with our latest stories, events, and more. You'll see a sign up link to our newsletters also in the episode notes. Now back to our conversation with Jyoti Rahman. Okay, now the question of the economy. On your Substack, which is called Mukti, you have a post in which you write, and I'm quoting: macroeconomic policy is like driving a bus. When you are on a bus, you want to get to the destination as fast as possible. Similarly, we want the economy to grow as fast as possible. Without growth, there is no job, income, or development. But just the way a bus needs to slow down if on a winding road or a crowded street, macro policymakers need to calibrate their policy settings to the economic conditions. Sometimes this means slowing the pace of economic growth so that the economy can stabilize. You go on to say that given several external shocks that Bangladesh had faced, it needed to slow down and stabilize, but the Hasina government pushed ahead and made everything worse. How does Bangladesh now fix this? How does it address the big bogeys of inflation and unemployment?
Thanks for first, quoting the substack. So, okay, right now, the single biggest problem is actually not inflation. The single biggest immediate problem is the banking sector. Okay, so there are about 10 or 11 banks. Of in total, Bangladesh has about 60 banks. Of these, about 10, maybe 11, depending on how you count them, are practically insolvent. They just don't have any money. They had been plundered by oligarchs linked to the Hasina regime, and these banks need to be somehow revived. That's the first step. And what the government has done, they have reconstituted the boards of all these banks. So they got rid of the old management and instituted new management. The next step is going to be some sort of audit. And after that, and these banks are now practically nationalized. We don't use that word anymore. because we're not in the 70s anymore. We don't do nationalization anymore. But practically, they are now wards of the state. So they would have to now eventually. So next step would be audit, and then after that, they would have to be sold off to somebody. And hopefully, they could be they could find buyers and so on. And this has to be done whilst maintaining confidence in the whole system, so that you don't end up with a bank run. The central bank governor and the new central bank governor is being very forthright about all of this, but also working with the Ministry of Finance, and with the IMF and World Bank and others. There seems to be, without getting technical about any of these things, there seems to be a sense of confidence returning to the sector. So that is one. It's too soon to say, right? I mean, maybe tomorrow we'll find out that the problems are much bigger than we thought, and therefore there will be a panic. Who knows? But at the moment, it seems that this immediate issue is being addressed. Next is inflation, and this is coming back to the quote that we do need to slow the economy because we need to stabilize the currency, and hopefully that would allow inflation to taper off, and then we can think about growth and all the other longer term issues. Again, this is probably something that we are going to see. We are going to see inflation coming off because the currency is going to be stable. The reason the currency is stable, one big reason, is because remittances. We are receiving record remittances. And this is something we had not seen in the last couple of years. And the reason for this had been political. So Bangladesh relies heavily on remittance, depending on who you are counting. There are between 10 to 25 million Bangladeshis who are overseas and work overseas and send money. For the last couple of years, before Hasina's fall, they had not been remitting money through formal channels. They had been using alternate channels. And one reason of that was there had been money outflow from Bangladesh, facilitating this informal black system, right? The other thing was that the currency itself was, on a downward trend. And, if I'm sending money through formal channel and the formal exchange rate is 100 taka per dollar, and you are offering me 105 in a side market somewhere in the back streets of Dubai or whatever, right? And for me, that 5 taka difference is a big deal because I have got mouths to feed back home, and every taka counts. So this is what had been happening for the last couple of years. And now the dynamics has changed because the money outflow through that illicit channel has stopped, right? This money outflow was the Hasina regime's cronies who were siphoning money offshore. That is not happening anymore. So the outflow has dried out. But also that because the currency has been more stable, because there is no confidence on the Bangladesh bank that, hey, look, these guys know what they're doing, therefore currency is going to be stable. So now for you as the money lender or the person who's running this hawala business, his hundi business in Middle East, for you, okay, it doesn't really make sense to offer me this extra premium because the official market is probably going to be the correct money, right? And therefore, for me, it doesn't make sense to go through your informal channel. I could just, use the app or Western Union or whatever and send money. So remittances are coming in. That should keep the currency stable, and that should help with inflation because we import a lot of our food, we import a lot of our fuel and so on. So if the currency is stable, that helps with prices. Unemployment and the long run growth, that is a separate issue altogether. And that I think we have to wait until the political system stabilizes and until we have an election and elected government. Until then, I don't think we would see those kind of strong structural problems being addressed.
Sure. Of course, one of the problems in the last couple of years was also that though there was growth, there was jobless growth. Again, that was one of the big concerns of the students and the whole reservation issue that finally spiraled into the uprising. Jyoti, at some point, elections have to be held, and the interim government has to give way to an elected government. What does the political landscape look like now? Who are the major players, and what do you anticipate seeing in an election down the road?
This is a very intriguing question. And of course, this is also something, that's fundamental to whether the democratic reforms sustain. So the BNP is the other largest, so the other large party other than Hasina's Awami League. This is a party that had won in the elections that it had actually contested over the years. It had actually won more elections than the Awami League, but it had been out of power since 2006. It had boycotted two of the last three elections, and the one that it participated was widely rigged. So this party has retained its strong grassroots organization despite last 15 years of sort of local harassments and arrests and intimidations and so on. And if there is an election, whenever there is an election, this party is probably going to win the largest number of votes, probably going to win the largest number of seats. It's hard to imagine a scenario where that is not the case. Possible, but hard. So they remain the largest party. There is a sense, particularly in online, in social media, that Jamaat and other Islamist parties have never been stronger, and so on. In some telling, sort of they could emerge as a serious contender against BNP. I personally think that that is actually far less likely than many people think for two reasons. One is historical, that Jamaat itself still carries the stigma of siding with Pakistan in 1971 in the War of Independence. And this stigma is a lot stronger than what we might realize through social media, because social media can have an echo chamber kind of thing, right? So there's so that's one part of it. But a bigger part is that these parties, not just Jamaat, but the other Islamist parties, are in fact heavily factionalized, and they don't have any well defined platform for governance. So the questions that you had asked earlier, for example, about what you do about jobless growth, right? Sort of you wouldn't find anyone with even a populist answer. So, sort of when people go for elections, people tend to vote for who can do things for me. This is as true in India, this is as true in Pakistan or any other places, right? And sometimes this means that they actually elect people who, sort of to the urban elite might think that, okay, why are you electing a gangster? Well, you are electing a gangster because the gangster is going to get things done for you, right? I mean, and again, this is something we see in whenever we have had elections in Bangladesh, but also in India and elsewhere. We often see individuals with they're not the technocrats and policy wonks, but they can get things done. I think that people don't appreciate how weak the Islamists are when it comes to actually doing things. So the Islamists are probably, I would say, overrated because of their social media presence. Conversely, Awami League, despite the massacre that Hasina had perpetrated in July, August, despite the last 15 years, and despite the fact that she has actually fled, which is something that has never happened in Bangladesh, that a government falls and then you flee. Despite all of that, Awami League probably still has a grassroots support that we might not recognize through social media and online presence and media presence and so on. So Awami League is probably underrated at the moment, except that it is extremely difficult for any Awami League politician at the moment to campaign for election because the memory is still very fresh and very raw. If the election were to happen in 12, 18, 24 months, who knows, right? By then, events would have moved on, and they may, especially if they can come up with some individuals, some candidates who were not linked the worst excesses of the regime. That's a possibility. And then there is the wild card, which is very difficult to tell by definition. What are the youths going to do? Are they going to form a party? The students. Well, they're no longer students because some of them actually are in the Council of Advisors. Some of them have left university. So they have formed a citizens committee. Is this committee going to turn into a political party? And if they do, what chances would they have? They might have a strong presence in the urban areas, again, because of the aura of the revolution, that, sort of they faced with the mighty Hasina, they faced the bullet, the police repression, and so on. So there are individuals with that kind of, stories to tell. But the country still is, it's not just a Dhaka city, right? There are 20 million people in Dhaka, but the country has 180 million, and 160 of them don't live in Dhaka, right? Yeah, that's the political landscape at the moment.
So, too early, we shouldn't write off the Awami League yet in a forthcoming election. But there has been a kind of push, a de Awamification, if you will, at least in the public sphere. And while there has been very justifiable anger against the party, but there have been very unfortunate physical attacks on people who have been members of the Awami League. Tell us what has happened to the Awami League since the fall of Hasina's government and her leaving the country.
So the de-Awamification, there are two elements to this. One is the de-Awamification of the state apparatus, and that is being done, as we discussed about the judiciary, as we discussed about the police, but is also going to be a long process, because while the top echelon can be changed relatively swiftly, there's entire, sort of middle and lower echelons of these machineries that would need time and so on. So there is that element. Politically, again, sort of I go back to the thing that the fall of Hasina was so sudden. So on the 4th of August, she had asked her party members to come out on the street and put an end to the way she called it, conspiracy and chaos and so on, right? Like, that's how she framed the whole movement, and she had basically asked her party men to come out on the street and take control. Again, her words. And this led to over 100 people dead on that day, 4th of August, by official counts. The true number might be, the numbers keep ratcheting up as we find out more and more. Even on the 5th morning, she had told the party that everything is going to be under control because, I'm going to put this to an end. And therefore, a lot of ministers, I mean, sort of the general sense among her party members was that, yes, she's got it under control, things will be okay. And they came, it came as a shock, surprise to them that, sort of that she had fled. She had not consulted the party rank and file, or even even her ministers, that she was going to resign or she was going to, flee. And possibly because, sort of even that morning, she herself did not contemplate this. So a lot of individual leaders were arrested, were lynched or attacked, assaulted across the country. Some of them had taken refuge in the cantonments with the army. And then it is quite murky exactly how this was arranged. I'm sure, we can think of many conspiracy theories or just simple explanation of money changing hands. Some of them have found their way into India, and then from India to Middle East and elsewhere. Others remain in Bangladesh and have been arrested. In many cases, the arrests actually had kept them safe from public anger, because if they had not been arrested, then probably they would have been assaulted. That is a challenge at the moment for Awami League to, even though there may be support, there may be 10, 15, 20% voters who would probably still vote for Awami League, who may still vote for Awami League if there is a Awami League to campaign and run. Right now, it is very difficult to see, sort of who could even face up and say that, hey, I am Awami League, I'm an Awami League candidate, vote for me, because the public anger is so much there, so intense.
Right. Yunus has promised to open investigations into, the many allegations of forced disappearances and other excesses during Hasina's time. Like you said, one of the commissions is a commission of inquiry to look into these cases, into black sites where people were allegedly held. How important is a resolution of these kinds of cases, these excesses in the Hasina regime, a resolution of the past for Bangladesh to go forward?
It's vital. It's vital because, as we had seen, for example, that the similar incidences in 1971 were not resolved. There wasn't any closure. Of course, 1971 is a different time. Bangladesh was much poorer and the destruction was much more massive and so on. Politics was much more unstable back then, with military coups and assassinations, two of the presidents having been killed and so on. Regardless, the fact that those wounds were not healed led to festering political problems throughout the years and decades. So it's vital that we avoid a similar repeat of that. So that's one reason why it's vital. The other side of this is also again why reforms are important. That this kind of thing never happens again. Remember, Awami League itself was also an elected government. They won a free and fair election in 2008. So it's not just that, like, sort of winning an election just because you are democratically elected doesn't mean that you cannot turn into a monster, right? Hasina did not come to power through a military coup, right? So she was elected and then she became a despot. So we want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So that's the other element. And this is why reforms are important. And then the third element is that this is difficult. The justice and reconciliation, rehabilitation. We in Bangladesh don't have much by way of experience in this. In fact, I would say probably across the subcontinent, we don't really have much by way of practical experience in this, right? I mean, whether it's the events of the partition or whether it's events of individual historical episodes, for example, the 1984 anti-Sikh riots, or whether it is the aftermath of Sri Lankan civil war. Sort of there isn't really much that we can draw on from our region. Definitely not from Bangladesh's own history, but not even from our neighbors who had suffered trauma, that we can say that, okay, this is how you guys did it, let's learn from you, because we haven't had. Yeah, while it is vital, I would be honest with you, it is also, if you asked me that, okay, what is one thing that you are not hopeful about, this probably would be it. I'm much more hopeful about the economy than about this. I'll put it that way.
Let's just talk a minute about the kind of disinformation that has gone around in the last 2 months. I mean, ever since the uprising started, I mean, we saw a lot of disinformation coming in from India, for instance, about the motivations of the protesters. But this has continued, like, even since August 5th, since the interim government was formed and while it's been functioning. I'd like you to clear the air on the perception of the revolution and the interim government on a couple of things. So, the first is the role of the military, because there have been these theories that the interim government is a prop of the military that's actually taking over Bangladesh. Would you like to clear the air on that?
Okay. Okay. So first, let me just note, I can just offer my views, right? So I actually was not part of the revolution. I had been an activist and dissident, but not on the ground. So, no, I don't think that the army itself had, this government is not a prop for the army, because the army did not want to take over. They could have taken over. Wakaruzaman, the army chief, could have declared martial law on the 5th of August. And, basically, if he had done that, I don't think there would have been, at least on that day, there would have been much opposition. And given the fact that he chose the words very carefully, he chose the words responsibility as opposed to power in his first address, time he appeared before TV, that's what he said. Given all of those things, I don't think he could have taken over, and he didn't. And which is not to say that this doesn't happen in future, right? I mean, his term he's there for 3 years. He had only become the chief in June 2024. He's going to be around until 2027. He may develop ambitions down the track. Who knows, right? But at the moment, I don't think he's the master, manipulating the strings, and the interim government is a prop. I don't think that's the case at all.
Right. The other specter that some people have been trying to raise is that Hasina's exit has opened the door to Islamization of Bangladesh. There is going to be extreme communalism that's going to come into play. What would you like to say about that?
This is a very good question. So let me give the example of World War II, and then I'll come back to it, right? So if you ask the Russians about what defeated the Nazis, their story is Stalingrad and millions of people fighting hand to hand against the Nazis and so on. That's the story the Russians would tell. And the Americans would talk about the arsenal of democracy and all the scientific breakthroughs and all of that. And the British would say that the lonely defender, the lone island, and Churchill, and all of those kind of things. And sort of they have all their stories. And by the way, our story from the subcontinent nobody mentions. Like, we too had fought and lost more soldiers than in that war than in all of our other wars combined. But anyway, so just the way that World War II has all these individual stories, and they all have, sort of thing, I think we're seeing a lot of that exactly the same dynamics in Bangladesh in taking credit for the uprising. So, and Islamists had been the first ones to declare that they did it. So that like they had all these clandestine cells in the universities, the madrasa students were the vanguards. And you see that in the social media and so on, because that's a narrative that they want to sell. But at the same time, we also know that BNP itself had been actually involved in, particularly outside Dhaka, to organize a protest, to maintain it day in, day out, requires a kind of political organization, right? Or political machinery. So there is that element too from the BNP side. But at the same time, it's also the case that this was also an organic popular uprising as well, in the sense that particularly after the internet was shut down, so during the revolution, so I think Professor Riaz talked about this, and this was also one of the points he mentioned, that look, this is why ground has shifted, because the middle class, the urban class, the people who usually are not bothered by day-to-day politics, people who are not activists, they have been hit and they're coming out. So there is that element as well. And as I mentioned earlier, the wild card of the youth politics. So the original organizers who started the movement back in June, July, and people who are now actually, they have organized themselves into the citizens committee. These people are not Islamists by any means. They have their narrative to tell as well. So I think what we're seeing in Bangladesh, there's definitely disinformation. There is no question about that. One of the ways Awami League can revive itself is through disinformation, through discrediting the whole thing, and so on, right? So there is that. And remember that they had siphoned off a lot of money. So that money can be made use, to pay for these kind of things. So there is that, absolutely. But there is also a contest for writing the future, right? And in one way, you can call that healthy, because this is what democracy is supposed to be, that like sort of contest of ideas and so on. So that's a positive spin on that. But whether that this has actually led to any more of an Islamization in Bangladesh than had been the case always, I think like until we have an election, this question is not going to be resolved. And as I said earlier, that like I'm skeptical about the Islamists' ability to garner much support, let alone come anywhere close to forming government or anything like that. I think that they will end up with what their historical norms had been, which is somewhere between 10% to 15% of votes.
One of the outcomes of the monsoon uprising really was that India, which is Bangladesh's biggest neighbor and had been Hasina's staunchest ally, found that it had backed the wrong horse. Back in May, a Himal contributor, Kamal Ahmed, had written about how people in Bangladesh were vexed by and wary of the Modi government's unstinting support to Hasina. Hasina, of course, fled to India in August. Take us through how the revolution changed the relationship between India and Bangladesh and even led to a bit of a tussle over the Hilsa fish last month, in September.
Sure. Okay, so let's start with the fish, right? So this is one of those things where like social media blows things out of proportion, but also that social media can also influence a good outcome. I consider the fact that we have exported, Bangladesh has exported this fish during the Durga Puja season. I think that's a good outcome, right? It is an important part of Kolkata's culture, and partition notwithstanding, the cultural bond between the two sides of the border is strong. And also that we actually had seen movements, we actually had seen demonstrations in support of the uprising in Kolkata and elsewhere. People who were calling for a ban of the export, as well as people who said that no, we should let this happen. All of this happened in social media. So, sort of, I mean, it's a, as an online writer, sort of, I have mixed feelings about this, right? Okay, so that's the fish issue. However, the broader issue, I definitely did not think, I doubt many thought that Hasina's fall would be this sudden through, sort of this way. And now it has left Indian establishment in a pickle, right? And the anti-Indian feeling, whilst I say that the Islamist feeling thing is way overrated, the extent of antipathy towards the Indian establishment has never been stronger in Bangladesh. So separate this from the Islamist point. And this is not an anti-Indian feeling as such, because as we actually saw with the fish incidents, that there were also vocal voices that said that, look, those guys in Kolkata are not bad. They supported us, and puja is important for them. Let's give them elite. So there is, so it's not an anti-Indian feeling as such, but anti-Indian establishment, this has never been stronger. And the longer Hasina stays in India, the bigger, the more festering this would be. And that is a problem for both countries, obviously.
Right. Okay, so beyond India, what are the other key relationships for Bangladesh right now? First of all, in the subcontinent and then around the world.
So India is obviously the biggest relationship in the subcontinent. The other countries, for Bangladesh's day-to-day economic and strategic reasons, are probably not significant, had never really been that significant in recent decades, at least. So Yunus himself used to talk about growing with India and China. And he had made those points for 15, 20, 30 years, that we need more trade integration with these giants. And this is when India and China themselves were much smaller, so going back to 25 years ago, right? So Yunus's inclination is very much in that direction. However, what happens after the election? That's a question, right? So Bangladesh will have to navigate the broader US-China rivalry. There is no escaping that. So, and the relationship with India would have to, that will also be colored from that perspective as well, that kind of global perspective. One thing that is not much appreciated, but Yunus has been pushing, and I suspect, at least from the BNP side, there is no disagreement on this. In practice, we don't know what it will be. Is a need for the appreciation that okay, we need to ally ourselves with other middle-sized countries such as Indonesia, Malaysia, both for economic reasons, but also as a kind of way to develop strategic partnerships, so to speak, right? It's not in the interest of the country to become a pawn in a global power politics, right? And the way to avoid that, one way to avoid that, is by being friends with other countries who are in the similar situation. So the first foreign leader to visit the new Bangladesh actually had been the Malaysian Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim. Symbolic for many reasons, right? That he had known Yunus for decades, Prime Minister Ibrahim, himself a dissident, former dissident or victim of persecution and all of that. But also, this is Bangladesh looking towards non-traditional friends, right? Or people who had sort of non-traditional allies from Bangladeshi context, looking beyond India and China and the big guys.
We've come to the end of our conversation, but I'm going to ask you for 3 recommendations. This could be a book or a film or a podcast or anything really to understand Bangladesh at this moment. So, what would you recommend?
This is probably the hardest question. So I'm sure you hear this a lot. So narrow things down to 3 is difficult. So I'm going to cheat and do a bit more. One challenge with Bangladesh is that a lot of the content, most of the content is actually in Bangla. However, there are some good English contents. So for the podcast or general regular writing, the place that I would suggest is a up and coming podcast called Nur al Din. I'll spell it for you. Nur Nur al Din, Deen. So Nur al Din was a 18th century peasant leader against the British. He's an icon of Bangladesh anti-colonial movement and so on. So this podcast is mainly in English and it's focused for a global audience or broader audience. And the need was felt basically during the July uprising. Okay, so there was a sense that, okay, look, we need to tell this to the world that this is something really bad happening in Bangladesh. So I would recommend that for things that are going on at the moment. For a magazine and some writers that I would mention, Bangla Outlook is doing amazing work. Again, something that had Bangla Outlook actually had started a bit before the uprising, but It has grown up during the uprising. So they have an English section. They have a Bangla section, but also English section. The English section does amazing interviews. So their most recent one, for example, actually had been with a few Indian journalists about the extent of disinformation and so on, right? So Bangla Outlook is doing amazing work. Writing by Professor Riaz, Ali Riaz. He has written books on Bangladesh. Those are important. Another writer who writes frequently about Bangladesh is somebody called Mubashir Hassan. He was, for example, quoted in the Time magazine last week. So anything that you get from Bashir or Professor Riaz would be there. And then finally, a book. So the book that I would recommend, this is not about today's Bangladesh because this book came out in 2015 or probably a bit earlier. Naomi Hussein's Aid Lab. So this actually sets the context of the post 70s or like how Bangladesh came to be where it was under Hasina. Okay, so this is a bit dated now because sort of events have moved on, but at least it gives you the bigger picture context from the breakup of Pakistan all the way up to about a decade ago.
Okay, that's really adding to my TBR list. Jyoti, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
That was Jyoti Rahman on the State of South Asia podcast. Himal has consistently brought you insight and commentary on the developments in Bangladesh, and you can find all the stories on our website, himalmag.com. You can read about how Sheikh Hasina pushed to make her daughter the regional director of the WHO Southeast Asia region, or how the Awami League government went after Pratham Alo, Bangladesh's top newspaper. You'll find these stories and many more in the episode notes. You can also listen to the South Asia Review of Books podcast hosted by Shweta Srikanthan. Follow the Himal South Asian podcast channel on your podcast app to find all our latest episodes, and you can share, rate, and review them. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletters to keep up with Himal's work. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. We'll be back soon with another in-depth conversation on the next episode of State of South Asia with me, Nayantara Narayanan. Thank you for listening, and see you then.